name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 17th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of October 5th, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I'm excited just to be recording this, honestly. Today has been one of the most eventful days, I guess you could say, in my life. My wife and I have been battling some illness. We had a couple different things that kind of went on. The day just kind of derailed, and maybe at some point I get into that a little bit further. I'm feeling okay. I'm a little bumped and bruised, we'll put it that way, from some weird things that happened today. And my wife's doing all right, but it's just, we both have been battling some different flu bugs and different things. So it's impressive just to be here and recording and being able to get back in front of you guys. But I know it's something to me that really matters. It's something that is important. And especially with the text that we're getting into this week, I think this is a week that could be really powerful for us to be thinking about, contemplating in so many different facets of our lives that I would argue we really struggle with as humans. And yet God's creation doesn't struggle with it nearly as much. But we'll get into that. But before we do, let's look back to last week's question, which was, where are you going to invest? In yourself or in the community for all of us? And I think this is what is a difficult thing. There is a time and a place that we need to invest in ourselves. But if it's purely just for ourselves, we lose sight of what our impact can be for so many other people. And the aspect of us being able to impact others, the aspect of us being able to impact a larger group and have that multiply because of the different skills and abilities that they have, I think is something that isn't given enough credit within our own culture, at least here in the United States. The aspect of us being able to do something, yes, for ourselves, but it has a bigger purpose of impacting the community at large, is something that's really important. And I think especially within the individualistic culture of the United States, I think it's something that needs to be considered, and especially when we think about it from our faith life as well. Yes, it's an individual faith walk, but it's also a community faith walk. It's the aspect of us being able to learn and grow and then making sure that we are giving that back in some form or some fashion. Making sure that we are continuing to build those relationships around us to make impact for generations. And we get into that a little bit this week in the 2 Timothy reading, but let's get there. So let's get into the text for this week. So one of the Old Testament texts that you can jump into is Lamentations chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. This is right after now Jerusalem has been invaded and has been taken over. And it's this aspect of the comparison of a widow and just how hard it is and how the people of Israel at this moment have turned away from God and have lost sight of God. And knowing that God will still forgive them, God will still be with them, but also knowing at that point, because of how they've turned away from God, there is aspects of them having to go through some difficulties that wouldn't have otherwise had to be there because of how they have rejected what God was trying to tell them in this place and in this time. And one of the Psalms then that can go with that is continuing in Lamentations, going to chapter 3, verses 19 through 26. And recognizing the gratefulness of what God is doing as long as we are able to be faithful. As long as we are able to continue to show that steadfast love that God has given to us and being able to pull that out into our day-to-day life, we then recognize the hope that we have in the Lord and recognize what God is doing with us because we continue in that relationship, because we continue in walking that faith step out, walking that out day after day. The psalm that also can go with it is Psalm 137, all 9 verses of it. And this is then recognizing, again, the weeping, the mourning on how Jerusalem is taken over. It's been taken over. There has been goods taken from an enemy army, and how this is something that is sad. And recognizing how we have to acknowledge our faults. We have to recognize that we betrayed God. We betrayed our relationship. We disobeyed what God was calling us to do. And then we have to live through that and recognizing how there is a time and a place for us to mourn that, to recognize how in certain ways that we've hit this rock bottom here in this psalm, but in our own lives, that there's times that we hit rock bottom where we have turned away, we've gone in a direction that we didn't expect to, and it's led us into despair. The other Old Testament text that we can jump into is Habakkuk, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, and chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. And this is one of the times where the prophet is crying out, how long, God? How long are the people of Israel going to be against you and not listen to you and have to suffer and go through all this? How long do we have to go through that? And then there's this huge section that gets cut out of the continued questioning from Habakkuk, where God then responds. And so at the beginning of here at chapter 2, it's the prophet Habakkuk then stating, well, then I'm going to wait and listen and recognize that God is going to give me an ear to be able to understand where God is trying to steer us. And recognizing that this is a faithful action to be able to help guide us into where we need to go next. And the psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 37, the first 9 verses of it. This is one of those moments, yet again, where we commit ourselves to the Lord. And in doing that, we recognize that God then will continue to be with us. And this is something then we have to fret. We have to recognize that the Lord being with us will help guide us and help us be more the people who God is steering us and desiring and wanting us to be. Being able to live out justice, being able to wait patiently and be the people that God has been for us, and that we then can be that out in the world. The epistle text then is out of 2 Timothy chapter 1, the first 14 verses. As I referenced, there's some really cool things within this section. We have yet another greeting here from Paul writing to Timothy, and he brings up then in verse 5, the faith that has gone on here, that this is the third generation, talking about his grandmother Lois and his mother Eugene, and how their faith has been, and recognizing that this is something to be given and this is not something to be ashamed of. And in doing this inspires us to go out and do things that at times might be looked at as weird or crazy or just unbelievable in certain ways, but recognizing that all the different things that we are doing then is that we are following in what God is striving for us to do. As we are listening, as we are hearing, that then we are able to go out and do these things, and recognizing that the judgment of man is not the same as what God is striving for us to do necessarily. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 17, verses 5 to 10. And after listening to Working Preacher, I have to agree with them. It is worth going through the first 4 verses of chapter 17 as well. But it's this recognition on how there are things that can cause us to be stumbling blocks. And this is where we get the millstone being hung over our neck, and recognizing that we then need to forgive each other and be able to work with each other in those first 4 verses. And this is then where we get this aspect of how do we increase our faith? And God responds with, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move this mulberry tree. It'd be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. But then he gets into this aspect, and again, for our ears, it's very hard to hear, talking about a slave who's been out in the field and asking to prepare dinner. And a good slave at that point and at that time would, yes, even though they have worked a hard day, that's what they would do. And so it's this recognition on how within our faith, we should be able to listen and hear what God is stating, and thus being able to go out and do likewise, and recognizing that listening to God and reacting to God is something that is vital for us to be able to be true followers of the way of what Christ is intended for us. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcast or commentaries or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction. Heck, I've already shouted them out in this podcast. It was a great podcast this last week, kind of giving some different ways to be looking at this and digging into it. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having art, prayers, hymns, the different colors, even daily readings to help prepare you for week after week as you are going into these texts. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, going through these same lectionary texts week after week, along with bringing in some different ideas and events, especially if you're more ecologically focused and thinking about it from more of a green perspective, and you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week. I'd highly recommend checking this resource out. There's some great stuff over there, and that'll be the first link down in the references section of the show notes. It's sometimes hard to listen, and there's no better place as seeing that than with a child. There's times where we all get our opinions, and we like necessarily having our opinions heard, having our opinions stated, and heck, I'm giving you my opinions on different things or different ideas on things. This is a great example of that. We often are that way. We like having our opinions, and it's the gift and the hardship of having free will and trying to live out this thing called faith. But I think then this is also a moment where Jesus is talking about having the faith the size of a mustard seed to being able to do these great things, and then compares it to being told to do something. And yes, it's hard for our ears to hear, but going and doing it is sometimes hard for us to get our heads around, because as human beings, that isn't necessarily how we think about things. That's not necessarily how we react. That's not how we do things typically. So then we need to spend time thinking about the rest of creation. And one of the big ones that we can start thinking about and start using as a reference point is looking at, how do birds know how to migrate? How do trees know that it's time to start turning off their chlorophyll to allow the natural colors of the leaves to come forth? How do plants in general know when to really grow and when to start shutting things down? These are questions that in a lot of ways we think about in a passing glance, but in a lot of ways there's a lot of things that are going on. So let's start with birds. Birds, the common hypothesis that has been studied and it continues to have support, is that they are looking and noticing the day length, and that the day length is affecting their natural hormones within their bodies to go from highly territorial into moving into a phase of their life where they are more concerned about making sure that they are going to build up fat storage, that they are working together to suddenly migrate. And when you think about migration just in general, there's a huge amount of trust that goes into that. There's this trust of, okay, I'm going to fly. And again, it's not like they can call or talk to necessarily other bird species on what's it like in Tennessee when I'm in Minnesota and I need to go through there to go on my migratory route. These are things that we take for granted today. They just have to, okay, I've eaten enough. I feel like my fat reserves are good. Let's start this journey and go. And I think there is an aspect to that of what we are called to in the faith, but I would also argue within how our 21st century minds work, that's a very difficult proposition to be here and thinking about. Of what does that look like? What does that mean? What does that mean just to pack and go without checking anything? Recognizing their hormones are changing and boom, they just go. Recognizing and predicting that, okay, things are going to be okay. There's going to be stopover points where I'm able to fill up and continue eating to be able to continue to have the fat reserves to get to my final wintering destination, or vice versa for the spring coming back up north. Thinking about trees is a very similar thing. Again, notice it seems to be around the day length cycle, recognizing that, okay, we got to start turning off the chlorophyll, the energy producing aspects, and start putting that and sucking that down into our roots to prepare. And I think about like where I've been this year. We've had early in September, we had some frost warning days, and there were some plants that I had that didn't do so hot off of that. And now I'm looking forward, and here we are in late September, and we're having 70-degree days, looking great. And in a lot of ways, within my human mindset, why wouldn't you keep producing? You're still getting great sunshine. You're still getting great heat. Why wouldn't you think about making sure that you are still producing more energy? Because there's more there to behold. But going back to last week and thinking about that, is it really worth getting every ounce out of it? No. They're recognizing that, no, it's a safer thing to do. We're going to trust the process. We're going to trust our signals. We're going to trust the thing that they've gone on for generations to do. And this is where, when we're talking about how climate change and stuff is affecting these native plants, this is one of the great aspects of it, and even with birds, because you're starting to play with these natural cycles that they have had for generations on this is what we do at this time and at this place. And suddenly they aren't able to do it. Suddenly there's huge changes on when it's going to be warm enough, when it's going to get cold, what's going on temperature-wise. But that's another story for another day. Faith, to me, in a lot of ways, is really just stating trust. It's trust at a very deep level. Trust that when something is said, that's what it means. Trust that whatever this person says, no matter what I feel about it, it's going to be the right advice. Trust that it's going to be for my betterment if I follow this teaching. When we look at Lamentations this week, talking about how we wish that we had listened, we wish we had followed through, we recognize we have a God who forgives and loves, and we need to work on that. Going through the Lamentation text and even the Psalm 137, Habakkuk is stating this similar type of stuff of why are we allowing ourselves to go through all this trouble, all these hardships, all these different aspects that make life difficult. Why? Why are we doing that? Why, Lord, are you doing that? Because if you just forced your will on us, it would just be easier. But then it gives us the predicament of free will, where God wants us to freely choose to be in relationship, to freely choose God. And we get in the Psalm 137 and how we recognize the gifts of what God has done. And then 2 Timothy, it's the aspect of, okay, we've had this generations of faith. Recognize how amazing this faith is. Recognize the gift that it is, but also recognize that in that gift of trust that is going both ways, that you are trusting in God and God is entrusting in you a calling on this is what I need you to do. Now go do it. That's faith in action. That's living out what faith is. That's where you have this aspect of increase my faith. If you had deeper faith, you could do all these amazing things because you just would trust in what God is telling you to do. No hesitation. It's just a trust that this is what needs to happen. That's the amazing thing to me when I get to this time of year and looking at bird migration in particular. Having had bird feeders up this year, watching how territorial these birds are, and heck, there's still a little bit here and there. But as the summer progressed and now we're moving into fall, a lot of those hormones of territory have dropped. And now it's this, okay, there's a feeding station here. Let's have 4 birds on a feeder and not worry about it. Not try to keep this territory for ourselves. We have to work together. This is something that's going to be better if all of us are working toward. Recognizing the journey ahead is difficult, but it doesn't mean that they're going to stay here. There's already birds that have disappeared. I haven't seen my hummingbirds now for a little while, and I won't see them for a while. But they had trust that they're going to go and migrate and they're going to make it. And what does that mean for us? What does that look like for us to have that type of faith, that type of trust, that God is telling us to do something and we just do it? Now, I also argue that's hard because, especially in the world in which we live, I'd argue there is plenty of messages and people are claiming that Christ is telling them to do that I would argue is not what I understand Christ to be, my understanding of who God is. And especially how that term, especially in the United States, is getting thrown around a lot, can be very difficult. And I think that's where Habakkuk really has a solid message. He goes to the watchtower not to look, but to wait and to listen and to hear what God is stating and to have conversation about it, but to listen and watch for God. Listen and watch for God's response. How often do we do that? How often do we really sit and watch and listen for God? I know in my own life, there's been plenty of times where I much prefer just continuing to move forward at the pace that I'm moving. And the more I recognize that sometimes the pace that I want to move at and the pace that God is wanting me to move at are very different. That's hard. I think that's an aspect of even just scientific culture. Just because we want to find an answer to something doesn't mean that we get the answer exactly when we want it. Doesn't mean that it's not worth pursuing. Doesn't mean it's not worth continuing to look into. I just watched a good little documentary. It's a little over an hour long on Hulu, talking about Cleopatra's Final Secret. And Kathleen Martinez is an archaeologist through a degree, but her main job is as a lawyer. And she's been searching now for Cleopatra's tomb for 20 years. And in the documentary goes through the different obstacles and stuff that she had to go through and how there's potentially some evidence now that she's on the right path. She hasn't gotten there yet, but she's on the right path. And how she has this huge desire to, one, she admires a lot of the characteristics of who Cleopatra was, and knowing that history is, it's amazing, strong woman mentality, especially rare in the ancient world, and how it's been extremely difficult to find, but yet how Martinez has also gone through some very difficult things where people didn't take her credibly. Her continued persistence and continued to strive and go just that next step, that little bit further, that trust that they're on the edge of finding something important is huge. I think that's something that we within our own faith sometimes don't do. That God is calling us into something, and yet we find ways to cut ourselves short. We find ways where, no, that's not what I'm supposed to do, or that would be really difficult, or that's not really fits with what my plans are. And yet we look at scripture, we look at like stories like Jonah. Oh, Jonah didn't want to go. And yet here we have God laying out, just listen. The amount of things that if you just listen, that will happen is incredible. And I think that's sometimes one of the hardest messages for us to hear and to recognize ourselves. So the question I have for you this week is, when was the last time you sat and listened and watched for God? When was the last time you sat and listened and watched for God? I think in the world in which we're in, the hustle and bustle in which we're in, we don't have this practice of sitting back and waiting for God. We figure that God's keeping up with us. And I think there's an aspect that we need to remember that if we are truly followers of the way, that should be reversed. If we are truly going to be good scientists, we don't force our way into finding a discovery, we allow it to slowly happen. When we look into nature, the cycle of the sun determines when they start getting ready for migration, getting ready for the winter. They're not forcing it. It's being, this is the way that you need to prepare. I think there's a lot of wisdom there that we can learn from. And I think in a lot of ways, we sometimes think it's easier just to force our own way instead of letting God work. Let God do God things instead of us trying to play God. It's hard, but it's important. And the sooner we're able to recognize that, the sooner we're actually able to really grow and be the people of God that God has called us into being. And I would argue, in doing that, we will increase our faith like the apostles were asking for. And I don't know about you, but I want to figure out ways to continue to increase my faith. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.